1 second, I'm just sharing this on our group.
No problem.
Share it on our page. And okay, so hopefully I'm just
okay.
Page and
looks like we're live. I'm already getting some feedback, so that's good. We'll I'm sure Bear's feedback will kick in just a second. There we go. We're live. I'm going to jump right into hitting. So that's good. We'll I'm sure Bear's feedback will kick in just a second. There you go. We're live. I'm going to jump right into hitting. So that's good. We'll I'm sure Bear's feedback will kick in. Is that you, Bear, or me? I'm hearing.
No, I turned mine off.
Okay. So that's good. That was Doreya. Okay, well, we won't strike you there, Doreya. All good. That's the beauty of going live. You always get that. So
there, I think it might be because I was sharing the link.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm going to hit live now. I'm going to hit record and we'll start the podcast because I want every second counts right now. So here we go. Boom, and we're back for another episode of AlphaCast. I'm here with Mike Winter and as always here with the affable Dr. Bear Paul Lando, coming to you live and direct from the beautiful Smith River here in the great state of Jefferson, where freedom still reigns supreme. AlphaCast is all about
affable. I can see you had your thesaurus out today, Michael, huh?
Yes, I actually, I was thinking hard today. What is the adjective of the week for Dr. Bear Lando? And that is actually one of the most, I think, obvious ones: affable, approachable, likable, fellow Dr. Bear Lando, so easy to talk to. And actually a couple people said they love a bear hug from you for the holiday season. So you can give them a virtual bear hug, Bear.
Coming at you, coming at everybody.
And it's a cold one today. Winter's been here for about a month already, so nothing new here. But we have Doreya Karim with us today. I want to get right into it because we have limited time, and this is a subject we could probably talk about for 10 hours straight today. Our audience is very keen in on biogeometry, thanks to Dr. Lando educating us about it for years. Bear, any points of biz before we hop right into this?
No, I'm looking forward to the talk, so I want to devote every minute to Doreya here, who's been so kind to join us today. And I do talk a lot about biogeometry because it's one of my favorite things and one of my most useful tools in life. And today we get to hear from the master. So let's just get right into it.
Well, it's my pleasure. So thank you for having me.
Oh, it's so our pleasure. And coming live and direct from Egypt on this AlphaCast, we have Doreya Karim to explore the science of resonance and form. She's the director of BioGeometry Energy Systems. Biogeometry has emerged as both a modern and ancient science that offers to balance the energy quality of our lives, environment, and technology. The applied science of biogeometry integrates the universal laws and natural dynamics of living energy systems that have been largely ignored in our modern civilization at the expense of our health and well-being. Biogeometry is based on a physics of quality, which includes a growing body of knowledge and scientific research that integrates rather than divides our worldview, thus narrowing the gap between the energy manifestations of spirituality and science. As a daughter of renowned Dr. Ibrahim Karim, Doreya Karim grew up with biogeometry and presently serves as the director of BioGeometry Energy Systems Ltd. In Canada, where she heads numerous biogeometry projects and is a vital player of the biogeometry research and development team, which aims to reduce all forms of environmental stress on biological systems. Doreya has worked directly under her father, affording the opportunity to gain experience in applying biogeometry in numerous fields such as regional environmental electrosmog solutions, architecture and industrial design, music, animal farming, and agriculture, and serves as co-director of the design department. Doreya is a building biology environmental consultant with degrees in both psychology and graphic design. She has lectured and taught in over 8 countries, having given over 30 biogeometry trainings. On this episode, we'll go deep in the understanding of form through resonance as the key to personal health, humanizing modern technology, and how architecture can be used to center the human body. Lando, this is core to everything we talk about, understanding the real science of the realm. Take it away, sir.
Amazing. And again, Doreya, thank you so much for making time for us today. I think you'd appreciate, I'm here at our farm, and every planting bed has rock formations in certain numbers. Trees are planted, finding the right orientation, with our biogeometry devices. We map out everywhere as far as the ley lines, not only in our house, but out on the farm. And, it's really such a useful tool to help us know what to do. And, I have a chemistry lab, which it's equipped to do very advanced, what they used to call alchemy. And alchemy is so much a mirror, or vice versa, of, I think, the principles of biogeometry, and that, you're really talking about resonance and taking things apart, purifying them to their original centered form. And then, also more important, the practitioner, the chemist, is actually needing to be a participant and in tune with the whole process, just like when you're using a radiesthesia device. Early on in my medical training, when I first went out in private practice and left the hospital, I, really came to the conclusion quickly that I was lacking an understanding of the more qualitative attributes of medicine that I didn't get taught. So I had to go to a lot of schools elsewhere. That led me into the study of radiesthesia back in the later 70s, at the old French school, and used a lot of devices and other instruments that were actually attuned more for medical, discernment, like the Lecker 10 and so forth. So when biogeometry, came into refinement, I really had full appreciation, because it brings so many more dimensions as far as how to, additional understandings, as well as techniques and instruments that are indispensable to me. So, Doreya, there's so much I'd like to ask you and talk about today, but maybe for the folks that don't understand what biogeometry is, and I know you've been asked this 1,000 times, but if we could just start there, just a really nice, concise definition, and then we can get into some more questions, a little bit about your background. And then, as I said beforehand, I have a lot of my biogeometry tools here, so I thought if we could make this more tangible for our audience, we could go through some of these tools together. So thanks again, and I'll let you just start maybe with what is biogeometry.
No, definitely, and I'll try to tie it into actually what you just introduced. So biogeometry, if we talk about, if we look at radiesthesia, for example, in radiesthesia, it's quite often you find the use of, especially French radiesthesia, a color quality scale. So color quality scale, which is once we start dividing things into scales, this is a very common approach, not just in radiesthesia, but really in any qualitative approach or to the human body, where you start dividing the scale can be colors, the scale can be yin yang, the scale can be polarity. Now, biogeometry comes in where we have, as part of, and in that, once you have a scale as a practitioner, then you're taught how to work with the scale. So you're taught, for example, the meaning of each quality as it comes up with a client, the meaning of each quality as it comes up in the land. Now, where biogeometry comes in is the goal of biogeometry is very specific, and it's a energy quality that can be identified through this scale that we call BG3. And we call it BG3 because it's in resonance with 3 color qualities. And what it is that we're referring to is the energy of a sacred power spot. So this was actually the birth of biogeometry, coming in and looking at, if we have all of these qualitative scales and ways to assess and balance the body, and we in the intro, Mike mentioned my father, so he's an architect, and he was the one who was looking at these scales and saying, well, as an architect, how can I develop an environment using these scales that is beneficial to everybody? If I'm using these scales and they're still within the realm of balancing or still within the realm of polarities, then I can't actually use it to create this perfect home or this perfect environment that is balancing for everybody, because we could be on opposite ends of the scale. And so this began the study of sacred power spots around the world, with sacred power spots being the centering quality that is the goal of biogeometry. And I think this is important because the word centering has been used a lot, and a lot of times it's actually confused with the word that we say, confused with the word balancing, where if you come in and I'm introducing you to a balancing quality, it might not necessarily be the same one that we both need. But as a sacred power spot, that's the true definition of a centering quality, because it's a quality that will lead to a balanced state for any person, regardless of where they are in the scale. And so biogeometry is actually, how can we access and recreate this energy quality so that we can bring in this environmental balance in all the work that we do. And this is, I think, the huge also other aspect of biogeometry is the role of the environment in health, and looking at understanding a lot as practitioners, we like to assess the body, and we like to assess the body in and of itself. So this is wrong, we have to give it this. We don't have a way, or we don't necessarily assess the body as just a medium that's immersed in environmental energies and is responding to those. And of course, part of those is your own personal, vital, emotional, and mental and spiritual energy. But there's another large part that is a holistic, environmental, vital, emotional, mental, and spiritual energy quality that you're immersed in. And so the only way that we can actually achieve this state is through the energy exchange balance between the body and the environment. And this is really the cornerstone of biogeometry and all of our applications.
Fantastic. We have members of our community that are very passionate about correcting conditions in our atmosphere, with the electrosmog and all the things that are affecting our health and our environment. And orgone technologies are a big part of that, and I believe they're very effective. But biogeometry, I believe, brings another dimension in that you're not just trying to counteract, noxious waves in the atmosphere or different toxins in the atmosphere, but you're actually considering the human interaction and how they affect us. And so, it's exactly what you're describing. One quick comment, if you don't mind, in the world of waveform physics, there's a great distinction between center and balance. Mm-hmm. And center, and just see how this jives with your understanding. Center, of course, is considered that pure light from consciousness that then, is responsible for the polarities. And the polarities, by definition, are out of balance. They're always seeking balance, but, they cannot be in balance as long as you're in that world. And so that's another thing I love that biogeometry brings to the table. It's, because in the healing arts, we're always talking about balancing things and not about centering things. And to me, there's a big distinction with that.
No, I think that definition is right on track with what I was saying. And I think, and the idea is really this possibility that we can achieve balancing through centering. That's the goal of biogeometry. So even when we talk about the human body, we talk about how it's possible to, or really we say our definition of spirituality is, you'll find the term used a lot, especially by my father, excellence of action. And that term is also pretty, I'd say it can be defined in many different ways, but he really defines it as a type of communication or connectivity with the whole. And so when we apply this, this can be applied in actual actions that we do on a daily basis. But when we bring it now to the human body, it's actually how much access we have going beyond exactly what you just mentioned, going beyond from really even looking at it, the archetypal template to the possible centering source. And with this communication and connectivity, when we can get it across all the different planes, the effect, the resultant balancing effect that we can see. Not that balancing can be achieved in so many different ways, but the root of biogeometry really is, we say you're a doorman. You open up to bring this energy quality into your space and see what happens. And of course, electrosmog is probably one of the main concerns that we focus on in biogeometry. And there's a lot there that we also focus on, I would say, a little bit differently, in the sense of, I know right before you were mentioning that the audience is very knowledgeable in this field, but just to differentiate also a little bit between the electromagnetic fields versus electrosmog, which we approach as a compression wave phenomena. And when you approach it as a compression wave phenomena, we understand that it's not just the field that we're dealing with. We're dealing with this standing fog that happens as a result of a movement. So whenever you have electromagnetic waves moving in the environment, we can pick up this compression wave effect that blankets larger areas. And it's also interesting because in biogeometry, we see that there's a connection between this type of non-electromagnetic effect that can be created, or that is created by the movement of electromagnetism in the environment, with our own emotional and mental state. And so when we see that, we understand that it's not just this physical effect that we're worried about, it's this complete multidimensional information exchange that we're trying to balance in the environment with, we'll say, current environmental stressors. And you mentioned some also a few minutes ago.
Doreya, is it safe to say you're coming from Egypt, and there is a grand tradition, a lore really out of Egypt, with the great Hermes Trismegistus and the Hermetic principles that led to alchemy, and this concept that we live in a mental universe, that the human form is really the generator of reality. And I know a lot of this has been termed mystical by academia today. Would it be fair to say that biogeometry is actually grounding this sort of ancient tradition out of Egypt into the modern ethos of science?
I hope so. I hope it's doing that. One of the things that's interesting, I'd say, that we bring up in this concept of how we're recreating our world, or this what we're living in, basically. One of the things that a lot of times when we get people coming to our office and they really want to understand a lot more about ancient Egypt. And the first thing that we have to explain is that the biggest misinterpretation that happens whenever we're looking at ancient knowledge, or even approaching sites in ancient Egypt, is you have to think of ancient man as a completely different species than us, not somebody that you can relate to. And it's a trap if you think that you can see the world the way they see the world. And so we learn this in biogeometry, because a lot of times it's only when we discover and measure something that we can go in and understand that it was already known in a way. But it's, and we talk about this really in regards to the shift from right brain perception to left brain perception. So the ability of nature or natural laws to speak through you and show up in your actions was a much more tangible thing. And one of the ways that in the special topics that this was explained to the students, we have classes that beyond our advanced training called the special topics, that this was explained to the students as we showed them, for example, in ancient Egypt, the 42 laws of math that you would be asked when they do the weighing of the heart, that you would be asked to basically see if the heart was lighter than a feather. And it was, everybody in that room was asked, so could you answer positively to these questions? And, there was kind of a silent moment. But the idea was to show that we wouldn't be able to, in this modern age, do that because we are not living through this right brain connectivity. Now, it's not to say there's many reasons why we had that shift from the right brain to the left brain, and not to say that it's negative. There's a lot that came out of it, but it's also what's causing a lot of tension now, because a lot of people are seeing that there's a doorway that closed, and they're seeing, well, how can we bring back that right brain access? Because you are right that we are living in a world that's being extremely affected by our own mental worldview. And unfortunately, that mental worldview is not a positive one, so to say. It does need a little bit more of that holistic effect to come in and help balance our actions, help balance how we look at things. And so this is really in what we're trying to say is important in biogeometry, is how do we not feed when we're dealing with, and you can look at this as a society, you can look at this as a single individual. How do we not feed that left brain perception cycle so that we're not trapped in it? And there's so many examples I can give you, things even just like how we look at time perception. From a left brain, you're always losing time. There's always stuff to do. And that's that mental reality that's created from our perception. Now, very rarely you'll find some people in a cyclical time perception. This might go to Dr. Bar, you're saying you're at the farm, right? So farm, you're a bit more in tune with nature. You might start getting that balancing effect of cyclical time perception in the daily life, which can remove some stress. And extremely unlikely will you find people in what we call stacked time perception. Stacked time perception is really completely in the right brain, where you are moving through emotional and mental resonances of information very fluidly, and just really not caught within that linear time perception. So this is just one example of how we bring about stress in our own environment, and also an explanation when we understand in ancient times how you would see a certain even fluidity when they would talk about time or movement through time. And you see this in ancient Egypt, you see this in some shamanic practices, you see it in, there's so many examples that we could give.
Geert and Steiner made a great attempt to explain how we made that shift away from the right brain consciousness into what they described as one-eyed colorblind perspective. And what I love is now we're actually getting practical measures, through things like biogeometry to ground it in and not just, intellectualize about it. But I think that, that was a great contribution back then. If you wouldn't mind, could we back up just a hair into BG3, because that's the center of everything, right? Yeah, and exactly. You mentioned that it's 3 waveforms that, comprise BG3. And we make a big deal out of it in the practice of biogeometry, measuring it and, bringing in a greater abundance of it and so forth. So could you maybe just give a little bit more perspective on that?
Yeah, so going back, I'll mention what those color qualities are, first of all. And it's interesting because it actually ties into, I'll mention the first one, gold. And gold ties into, we started off this conversation talking about alchemy. And I'd say that one of the things that from the training that we bring up really in relation to alchemy is the explanation of, there's a difference when we talk about a color quality versus a color. So we separate between a color. A color is what, a lot of people refer to as a frequency. We try to differentiate between the term frequency and quality, where frequency is not multidimensional in nature, but quality is. It's part of a repetitive scale. And we could do this by understanding this idea of the cross application of scales, where you can begin to understand the properties of vibrational qualities through things such as color, which help give us a scale in biogeometry, and sound, which help us understand harmonics and resonance. And so when we look at alchemy, we understand that what the alchemist is trying to do, the goal, is not to reproduce a grain of gold. It's to resonate with what we refer to as the higher harmonic of gold. And through that resonance, have a transformation where a piece of gold becomes like a certificate, not the gold. And so that brings us, so again, first quality is gold. Second quality is a higher harmonic of what we call ultraviolet. So that's a property that you find at dawn. And then also it has many many similar effects to ultraviolet light. It's purifying water that's really, you'll find water that is really purified or in sacred power spots has that very strong ultraviolet quality. And then a quality that we call negative green, which as a color is a grayish color, and it's a type of communication property. And so what happened was this physical radiesthesia and French radiesthesia, as you know, it has a long history of working with different quality scales. And like any system, these different quality scales each have their effect, can be used for healing in a certain way. Those listening who are familiar with different types of color healing might be in very familiar ground right now. But again, when my father inherited this work as an architect, he started looking at, okay, so there was already this notion that saints had a very strong negative green, had a lot of negative green in their system. Like we said, negative green is this communication property. So there was this idea that it could be used to evaluate how spiritual you are, which we would never do in biogeometry, ever say how spiritual someone is or isn't. And then there was also, they would say that they would find this quality a lot in the tombs of saints. So this was the birth of biogeometry, where my father, when he was given this work, it was said that there would be an Egyptian who would revive the science and revive it safely. And so he started looking at sacred power spots and looking at, okay, so there was already this negative green as an idea of spirituality, but it's not enough to identify a sacred power spot. So what other color qualities are present in a sacred power spot? And he found that with those three combined together, you can pick up the energy of a sacred power spot. Now I say combined together because when you start measuring these qualities separately, you can't combine them to create a power spot. They have to occur simultaneously. And so when you're able to detect them, then you can start seeing where they are in forms, where they are in numbers. So the first number that gives us BG3 is 16. And so those familiar with the Fibonacci series are going to understand why that 16 relates very much to the golden ratio. But then we have other numbers, 19, 28, 34, 43. These are all number qualities that will have these three energy qualities within them. They are BG3 numbers. So there's also angles that give us BG3. So really it becomes a science where we can bring in the centering quality. I mean, we talk a lot about bringing it into design, but it can be brought into any field.
Wonderful. And when it comes to BG3 and its three attributes, do the different numbers or resonance have to do with the proportion of each of the three waveforms? Because BG3 can be comprised of different proportions of those three elements, right?
So, I mean, the interesting part is that you have, for example, one angle, but if that angle is a BG3 angle, it will have those three qualities inherently. So one angle inherently giving you those three qualities, or one color inherently giving you those three qualities, one location giving you those three qualities. So it's basically what we look for is those occurrences in nature, because what happens is if we look at, for example, a circle, so those familiar with the radiesthesia might be familiar where you can have a vibrational color scale. And so if we look at this vibrational color scale, there's different parts around the scale, different angles. Yeah. And so I see, so that, for example, right there, the horizontal pendulum has exactly what I'm saying. It has a circle, and you can see different color qualities that are placed according to their resonant location on a circle. And around this circle, we will find different angles. And if you want to say colors, different angles or different colors at this point, it's interchangeable, that have BG3. And so this, for us, is very interesting because basically, if we look at in the physics of quality, you always find BG3 at the center of a shape, any shape. But if we take a circle, we find BG3 at the center. Now, it's interesting because the parts, the areas around the circle where we find BG3 is actually the manifestation of the centering quality into our reality. And these are the angles and colors that we use. And these are the angles and colors that we use so that then, let's say you are doing a type of, you're approaching something where you're trying to balance with a specific color. You're not looking for the color. You're looking for the centering effect within the color to achieve that multidimensional healing. And why am I saying multidimensional? Because as soon as you have the center on the periphery, you've gone across all the planes of nature. When you deal with shapes and you can measure forms, things become much easier to measure. Because, for example, whenever we're dealing with we talk about the planes of nature. So we talk about things like the different levels of the human body, the vital, emotional, mental, spiritual. So here we actually have shapes that are in resonance with all of these. Now, as soon as we understand where these shapes exist or where these levels exist in a shape, we can measure them. So even when we draw a circle, for example, we find that we start picking up energy from the center of the circle, that centering quality right in the middle. And then we expand out and we see that the circle from the outside, we see the physical shape. Now, from the center to the periphery is not empty space. And so we begin to understand it's not empty space, and we begin to actually understand locations where we can measure what we call the forming process, where you can measure that circle being formed from center to periphery. And then we have the shapes on that card, or I even see the human archetype ruler there.
Sorry to interrupt. I'll just talk so the camera will be on me for a second. This is a little card with all the different shapes. And then we have, I have a whole stack of strips here also that we'll maybe talk about when we use in conjunction with the human archetype ruler. And then also earlier I was holding up a pendulum that has 2 dials, and we're trained in biogeometry how to set those dials in order to measure the qualitative aspects of color. When I'm in my lab and I make things out there, throughout the whole process, I do measurements to determine what changes are happening through my laboratory processes. And you'll see, different readings as far as the qualitative side of, what's going on through the alchemical laboratory processes. And then also when I have finished products and I'm combining things back together, I use this quite a bit in order to find a harmonic that best works with certain proportions and things when I put them back together. So they're very useful for a number of things. But I don't want to interrupt your flow, but would it be helpful maybe to just talk about why the heck a pendulum, has anything to do with anything and how it works? Let's see, what do I have? This is the IK, which I love this one because you can find your little personal wavelength and then, measure things specific to things and people. And then we have the, the straight BG emitter here. And can you maybe tell us, what these geometries do and how it works and how you can actually pick up an accurate reading with a pendulum-like device?
So I think I'll also start just by explaining our goal with the pendulum, because a lot of times the most common practice with a pendulum is connection with the subconscious and training the pendulum to react to subconscious information, what we can sometimes refer to as automatisms. And This is what we call the school of mental dowsing. Now, biogeometry is different in that we don't actually train any students to have the pendulum respond to our own subconscious. We actually try to differentiate and do a disconnect from subconscious information when we're working with the pendulum and tune to qualitative scales. So what we mean by qualitative scales, just showing it's good we've been speaking about the horizontal pendulum, because that's an example of a qualitative scales, things like color quality scales. And so when we work with, the first pendulum you showed was the IKUP. And that one specifically, like you said, is useful in what we call a personal wavelength measurement. And the personal wavelength measurement, actually, what it does is that you tune into a person by finding the wavelength, it's actually a length, that is most in resonance with them. That length could also be translated on the horizontal pendulum to a color quality. A lot of times that color quality is actually related to the time you were born. You get a wavelength that allows us to become sensitive to either our own energy system, more sensitive to our own energy system, or to, if you're measuring somebody else, to their energy system. And from that, we can begin to evaluate if something is in resonance with us, which we would say strengthening the energy field, or not in resonance with us, weakening the energy field. And the BG16 is a little bit different in that rather than trying to focus on gaining resonance through wavelength, which you can do with any pendulum, as it becomes an extension of the body, you can actually use it. It's designed to detect BG3 through the quality, we talked about the 16, through quality of 16 discs. So it's designed to naturally detect BG3. And so the things that you mentioned early on saying, well, in the land, we, for example, whenever we're planting, we find the best angle to place a tree. That would be the useful pendulum to focus on. Now, there's another part I'd say that's very important in the biogeometry work that we should mention, is our approach with having the center and quality be part of everything, as well as even in the evaluation of homes or the body. What we try to do is when we're going in and evaluating the body or evaluating a home, we don't actually go in. A lot of our focus today as energy workers is looking for problems and how to solve them. But what that ends up happening is the practitioner or the person is exposing themselves all the time to problems, and they become tuned to finding problems. And so our work actually involves first centering and then doing an evaluation. So what that means is even if we're approaching the body or we're approaching the home, it doesn't matter to us in the beginning what the problem is. It matters to us to achieve a centered space. And whether that centered space is a centered space for the body or a centered space for the home, that's the goal. Because it doesn't, if you don't achieve that, then it doesn't matter. Any solution that you place isn't going to work. It's not going to be sustainable. So first we achieve the centered state, then we do our evaluation. This is an important practice because the work actually strengthens our energy system versus becoming depleting to our energy system. And so this is where the BG16, even though when we first introduced personal wavelength, a lot of people will gravitate towards that tool because it gives you more information about yourself. Once you've worked with biogeometry for a while, it's actually just looking and recreating BG3 that we see as the path that we need to take, both for ourselves and our clients and the general approach. So I'd say also a good example that people can begin to understand with physical radiesthesia is something like looking for water, because looking for water leans actually more towards physical radiesthesia than it does to mental dowsing, because your body is actually a witness for water. And what you do is you hold something at, the most common is people will see like a wooden stick that somebody's holding like this. And what it's allowing you to do is pick up the resonance once you've picked up once you've detected water in the ground. Now, some people do this practice subconsciously, but you don't need to. All you need to do at this point is to become that vibrational witness for water. And once the resonance is there, you will see the reaction. So you'll find this also commonly a lot in other physical radiesthesia pendulums, not biogeometry ones, but if somebody's looking for something or trying to pick up something, we don't go into asking questions. They will actually have pendulums with things like pendulums that you can even open up and put the substance you're looking for inside. Or sometimes you'll carry the substance that you're looking for so that you try to serve or try to become the resonant vibrational witness of the measurement.
And since you're talking about looking for water, that would maybe be a good segue into ley lines, energy lines actually in the earth. And as I held up this horizontal pendulum before that has all the different color qualities that you dial in to create an angle so that you can test with the pendulum. You can also add on these little metal bars at the bottom that can discern different ley lines in your house, to see if they're detrimental or beneficial where you sleep, or maybe out on the farm here if there's something that's maybe not good for a planting bed. So could you maybe talk a little bit about these ley lines, how these are picked up, and why it's a good idea to know about them?
I mean, there's two things I'll say. So one of the great things is those tools that we have. There's what we call the horizontal pendulum, and then there's the vertical pendulum, which takes those two rods. Yeah, and so
here's the vertical in case anybody wants to see it. And before I was holding up the horizontal. And it's just, you can see the dials are either in a vertical or horizontal orientation.
So those familiar with French radiesthesia might be aware that in French radiesthesia tools, the vertical and horizontal qualities, a lot of times you would be finding them using the same pendulum. They were not separated. And actually, when biogeometry was first taught, there was the virtual cone pendulum was part of the curriculum, and the virtual cone has where you actually pick up the vertical and horizontal in the same pendulum. But we've divided them completely for accuracy, as well as to not confuse what you're measuring. And so the horizontal pendulum is actually used to measure beneficial qualities, and the vertical pendulum would be more for harmful energy qualities. So beneficial is in, like you just mentioned, if we're talking about geopathic stress or ley lines, you'd be looking at the horizontal pendulum for ley lines, or much easier, the BG16, which will just combine the three qualities for you. And then if we're looking at stressful areas, the vertical pendulum. Now, the vertical pendulum is actually really a great tool because it allows you to pick up stressful areas in the home even after they've been corrected. And so this is actually what we do, is we will correct the space, we will center it, and then do a mapping. And that's important because it changes the relationship of the practitioner to the space, everybody in the home to the space. So we're not going in and just identifying the weak areas and then trying to correct them. We're identifying the weak areas and verifying that we've already corrected them by the time we're doing that. And so this will allow you to either find areas to avoid planting, like you said, or areas that you're actually correct, areas that you might focus a correction on. And more than that, of course, once we start understanding the nature of geopathic stress, we understand that there's specific qualities in geopathic stress, namely a quality that we call vertical negative green. So we talked about negative green being this communication, and we've talked about it as a spiritual energy quality. So we do differentiate. There's two aspects to it. So there's one, for example, that you will find horizontal negative green in prayer. Vertical negative green would be more in things such as X-rays, for example, where you still have this penetrative communicative property, but it's not necessarily in a centered state or a balanced state. And so you will find this in things like geopathic stress or lines in the land, like you're mentioning. And it's important to also understand that vertical negative green sources in our environment are in resonance. Just like BG3 and horizontal negative green sources in our environment are in resonance. So when we begin to work on the environment as a whole, we begin to then lessen the effect of all of vertical negative green on our system. And what does that mean? That means things not just the geopathic stress, things such as electromagnetic fields, things such as disease, things such as even things such as negative mental thoughts and emotions will create this energy quality in the environment. So those two tools, definitely when you're looking at the land, will allow you to have a general assessment of the land. And then with your BG16 there, coupled with that human archetype ruler, I mean, if we're gonna, I think, mention the work, that's probably the most important tool, because what does that human archetype ruler do? Is it allows us to actually, when we're working and we need a scale, kind of an environmental scale. So that's that ruler.
Here's an archetype ruler, if anybody wants to see them. This is my favorite of all of them. I use this all the time. And what's great about it, we can talk more about it later, but the wonderful thing about biogeometry is you're going beyond that quantitative time and space continuum, and you can affect anything, anybody, anywhere at any time without being there with them. So please go on.
And so the ruler is actually a good example of how we assess that a space or the body is centered. And so we actually check because once you have all of these, again, a lot of times it's very common to just put specific solutions on lines or areas and try to work with the land in that way. But we don't do this approach because that's working with the land divided. So we never approach the body or land as something that is not one system. We first approach it as how can we get the centering quality across the whole system? And so we will put things like general shapes around the whole area or general shapes on the body so that we're raising that centering level. And we use that ruler as our first assessment scale. And so that ruler, for example, will tell us, okay, we have the centering quality on the vital level. We have that centering quality on the emotional level, on the mental level. And of course, we connect it to a witness of the land. We connect it to a vibrational witness of the space to get that evaluation. And that goes back to that first definition that we gave, which is connectivity across all the planes and getting a sustainable environmental solution. We need to have that centered, we need to achieve a certain centering effect across all the planes to know that we have a sustainable solution for things to hold. And so that really is the goal of the work that we're doing. And then once we have that, then we go in and we'll place specific solutions on the areas of geopathic stress or try to emphasize the areas where we have a power spot. And then when you have a larger piece of land, of course, then you can come in with ideas of how, like, we can then look at different master planning ideas that have been there since ancient times, where they would identify the main, I mean, if we look at in ancient Egypt, you would, of course, identify the main power spots and place a huge pyramid on top of them, a huge emitter on top of them to have that energy quality emitting throughout the space. And so, or you can look at, for example, when we look at Roman times, where they would identify the main ley lines, and the crossing of the main ley lines would be the navel of the city. Roads would be planned according to this. And so we do the same thing, for example, in a piece of land. If you can identify a natural power spot in the land, how are you going to incorporate it? Are we going to create pathways in between power spots? Just like pilgrimage roads throughout the ages, are we going to create pathways? How are we going to incorporate this power spot into a place where we can gather? If we're looking at a larger community, what can we place on that? Is it a school? Is it, I mean, we don't, there's no Pharaoh's house that we're placing now, but that would have been one of the criterias. But is it a school? Is it a market? Is it a water source? Right? So this is important. Can we create our water source to be within this power spot? Is it a park? So this is the idea that you can apply it. You can apply these principles from the smallest to the largest scale.
I have a question, Bear.
Go ahead, Mike.
might help a little bit people that are new to this. I love the analytics we're seeing with all these measurement tools. And then Doreya, you mentioned then the solutions. Now, are these solutions all physical shapes being placed in the environment, or are we also talking about etheric shapes, thought forms, stuff like that?
So there is this, I'll say that also one of the things that we do try to emphasize a lot is we tend to forget the strength of the physical. And so a lot of times we talk about the shapes anchoring, being our anchoring solutions. There's a lot that we can do. So there's a lot of rituals and things that occur on higher levels that we can do, even clearing and cleansing rituals, different things like that. But then we tend to forget that those rituals are part of an environment that's always in constant information exchange. So when you have a science of shape, you actually begin to see that you can tangibly shape the environment so that it affects the higher levels. And so a lot of times, and this is how we approach it in biogeometry, because there's so much, and you'll actually find this approach as well in ancient Egypt, where the physical, a lot of times we try to move away from the physical versus seeing it as an opportunity. And we don't look at this in biogeometry. It's not that the higher levels are vibrating at higher frequencies that we're moving towards and trying to move away from the physical. If anything, it should be very clear to everybody that the easiest way to change your mental and emotional and vital level is through physical action. And this doesn't need biogeometry to see. It's physical, positive physical action will have a ripple effect across vital, emotional, and mental planes. I could say even more strongly than positive thoughts and emotions. Positive thoughts and emotions will not have as strong of an effect on the physical level as positive physical action will have on mental, emotional levels. And so it's the same idea actually with the shapes. You can put in so much effort and energy, and you can work on these higher levels. You can put in all of this energy, this effort and energy to achieve the effects through work on just the higher levels. But first of all, the idea that the levels are separate is we have to speak about them as separate. But at the end of the day, even the human archetype ruler, a lot of times we have to explain that it's an evaluation tool, because you can't ever have a balanced physical state without a balanced vital, emotional, and mental state. You can't have a balanced emotional, mental state without a balanced vital and physical state. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 that we separate them and talk about them, because you actually technically can't separate them. But that's the idea now, is that the physical shapes make the work so much easier. It's like you can put in, there's all of these things that we can do with our etheric bodies, things that you can achieve, things such as you can move things, for example, there's people who can move things with their mind, but they will train for many, 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 many years to be able to achieve something like this and put in so much energy. And with shapes, it's just an easy key. You begin to learn shape, the language of shapes, and you have a key where you're not putting in as much effort to try to create shapes that will stay on these higher levels. And so even when we're doing things, a lot of times when we do visualizations, we will actually tell students so for example, we have a visualization where we imagine something we call the net. And, a lot of times you can do these visualizations without using physical action, of course, but you will find that when we teach it, we actually teach everybody to do it with a physical action. Imagine that you're pulling up this net to help cleanse the space. And the idea is that even that physical action helps create the mental energy quality. And that's much easier than trying to get the mental energy quality to recreate the physical effect. So that's why you'll always find us using shapes. It's not to say that we don't have a lot of students who say, I was able to do this remotely, or this works in this way. I never had to put the solutions there. It could happen. But then you're always going back and checking and checking and checking, and you don't necessarily have a sustainable solution.
Yeah, it's how we relate health to the
So-
body here, and why we are into physical activity and athletics and surfing and digging holes on the farm, because that that direct interplay with your physiology. We live on a physical realm, and that is how we can measure things and how we know things are working. It's like that's brilliant. Thanks so much. I have one more question, Bear, on the BG3 thing, because I'm very new to all this. I've been gleaning this from Bear for years, but I haven't taken any coursework or anything. On the BG3, is there a direct correlation to nature in itself? I'm thinking sort of like, for instance, if you're familiar with Star Wars, the midichlorians, where the Force, like Yoda lived in the Dagobah system because of the dense nature there. Is there a direct relationship between nature in that sense? And then my second part to that question is, does nature create the natural shapes in and of itself that increase that proper resonance?
Okay, so I think to answer this question, and I hope this actually answers this question, is we're going to say in biogeometry, the first question to actually ask is why is something formed the way it's formed? Or what's the purpose of shape? Because when we look at things, why is it, we talk about an archetypal template, for example, and we'll say an archetypal template for a human being. Why 2 eyes? Why 1 head? And so when we begin to study this, we begin to understand shapes. The purpose of shapes is to contain energy. And when we can take the leap of understanding, so far, I'd say when we approach things related to healing, everybody's okay with approaching. If we talk about things such as healing with sound, most people will be like, okay, yeah, I've done that. I've gone to a sound bath. Healing with color or light now, people are with me, okay. And then I go healing with shapes. People are like, whoa, what are you talking about? Maybe now with a little bit of sacred geometry becoming more popular. Pyramids is a good example, but it's still not very familiar. But when we step back and we understand that basically sound and color, these are just ways of differentiating different vibrations. And they will each have a different effect on our brain. And so we come back now and we look at shape as an energy quality. And when we begin to study things such as, if people are familiar with things like a chakra system, we talked about shapes, all shapes having centers, or these BG3, this BG3 at its center. Now, the human archetype ruler is actually called the human archetype ruler because it was developed based on, if you look at in ancient Egypt in the temples, there was certain proportions that they would draw the human being in. They seemed very rigid, and they were referred to as archetypal proportions. And what actually ends up happening is when you have a simple shape like a circle, I can tell you, oh, there's BG3 right in the middle. Now take a shape that's the shape of a human being, and it's not just one center that we're dealing with. Then we begin to study the shape. And it happened to be that when we studied the shape, just like we find it in the center of a circle, we study the shape of the human archetype, you find it across the areas that are referred to as the chakras and other systems. Now, you can measure this on a shape of a human being. You don't need an actual human being. And so a lot of times when I say this is where even in class, we just finished an advanced training, and there was a long discussion about this, where we had to explain that, yes, that shape is a forming process, and we can measure just within the shape these energy vortices that people really refer to even as things like the birth of the life force in the system. So that brings us to nature. When we understand that it's the way that something is formed or shaped actually deals with how it exchanges energy in the environment, we find the same thing in nature. In nature, every shape or every form is based on a template that is exchanging information on all of these levels. And so this is where we would find that bridge between biogeometry and natural forms. Now, of course, there's a lot of things that I can give you specific examples where we found that, for example, when we were looking at developing a classroom for autistic children with the Autistic Society here in Egypt, and looking at the types of shapes that are that can cause imbalances. And 90-degree angles was a major one. And you can look at 90-degree angles as not being a very natural phenomenon.
They call those the angles of sorrow.
Yeah. So there's and then there's a few. I mean, I was. I know also I was seeing there was a really good film after I mentioned that sometime, and somebody said you should watch that film with I think it's called Temple Grayson, and she had shown even the cows how you would take them through different pathways avoiding these angles, and there was a different they would react differently to how they would move throughout. I don't have the exact fact, but that's the general idea. They would move very differently in the space with less stress.
And she was autistic too, wasn't she?
Yeah, and she was autistic too. And so things like 90-degree angles, perfect spheres, giving them these balls that are just like perfect spheres as toys wasn't also was a little bit stressful. So these perfect shapes that we don't really find in nature, we're finding we're causing stress. Now, the interesting thing also for us is that when we look at things such as autism and ADHD and looking at those, when we were looking at creating those classrooms, whenever we said anything was imbalanced for somebody who's autistic or somebody who's had ADD or ADHD or, as my father likes to say, had special abilities, those things were all imbalancing for all of us. It wasn't just specifically them. There might be more sensitivity that they were getting from having these shapes all around them, these sharp 90-degree angles. And so we do begin to see that it's very also easy to see that the way that we build is not in tune with nature in any way. And, it's like we mentioned in the intro, I mean, we did talk, I do have my consultation as a building biologist. I don't practice as much, more focused on biogeometry, but it was important for me because we work with a lot of building biologists. And in that school, you can already begin to see, especially in North America, how after World War II, things became much more of a consumer society and how we can build houses quickly. And part of that also was how we can separate ourselves from nature. How can we make sure that everything is insulated and we are kind of boxed up inside? And so this is, I think, a very, it applies to everything that we are looking at in terms of the body, the space, where we don't look at everything as being a layer of information exchange.
So with biogeometry, we can reconstitute that natural medium or BG3 in any space, right? So to me, it seems like a perfect solution. A lot of the devices and technologies out there that are, meant to help our biology and to deal with all the noxious substances that are aimed at us, are about kind of buffering or blocking. But the way I like to think about biogeometry is you have a dirty sidewalk and, all you do is you open up an aqueduct and the pressure of that nice new clean water is just going to overcome anything on a dirty sidewalk. So, it's the same thing in the practice of medicine. There's a reason why doctors don't live as long as regular people. And it's because we are always focused on what's wrong, the problem, and then unwittingly immersing ourselves in those, vertical waveforms. And, it takes its toll on our own body. And what I love about biogeometry and biotrain medicine, same thing, you're not focused on the problem, you're focused on functionality and how to get things centered again. And in biogeometry, you have the dimension of having devices where if you are measuring vertical waves, you can protect yourself at the same time and know that you don't want to overstay your welcome. You get your information, you maybe wear your medallion and, a biogeometry signature ring, whatever, things on your own body that are going to reconfigure things that are more compatible with your biology. So, Yeah, fantastic. There's a
Bear,
couple
Bear, would
things
a
I'd
good
really like.
Bear, would a
Mhm.
good visual of this be, and Doreya, say a flowing river is the life stream that we're all in. We don't see it per se. And if you put a cube in, those sharp angles are cutting at that water. It's blocking it. Where if you have nature in a stream or in a river is all rounded rocks for that reason, and it flows through. So that's the shapes we're talking about. So when we have a shape in our room, in our space, we might think that's just a shape, but there's a field and we're all connected, and it's shaping our reality by having that literal physical shape in our area. Is that a good analogy?
So we have maybe we go through a few gadgets here, and they're ranging from general folks without any training that can benefit with biogeometry all the way to advanced students. And the most basic one is the cube here that I keep in my office because it's full of electronics in here. Can you explain a little bit about that?
So the cube actually came from, we had probably the most known application of biogeometry when it comes to electrosmog is, so I should say my father, he's an architect, an engineer who graduated from ETH in Zurich. So that's the technical school of Zurich. And there was started off as one area, Hamburg in Switzerland, where they installed a cell tower, and that's called the Hamburg emitter. They installed a cell tower.
If folks want to visualize that, this is what we're going to be talking about here. And in biogeometry, as students, we learn how to dial this in and, achieve what Doreya is about to explain to us.
So they installed the cell tower, and there was a lot of complaints of physical problems and mental emotional problems coming in. And they said, as well as things such as there was issues with the animals. They were seeing more and more cows having miscarriages. There was a lot of ecological imbalances that they were noticing. And then some people were getting headaches to the point where they were sleeping underground. And so they just said, there's a video where they're saying, we're going to blow up this tower if nobody gets us a solution. So there was a colleague of my father's, or a friend who knew of biogeometry, and said, you think you can provide a solution? And so we went in and provided a solution, I would say, on the tower, but there's also full-scale solutions in the area. There's different shapes placed all around, but on the actual tower, so it was placed in a church. Placed in a church was also another reason that we think that there was a huge impact, because the church itself was on a power spot and was a gathering space for the community. And so you could see, when you go up in the church, there was different antennas on the windows of all the church, and on the back of them, there's actually that shape that you just mentioned, the Hamburg emitter being placed on the back. And so there was a study done a week later where the news came and said, the residents said, well, our symptoms are gone. And then 2 years later, there was a follow-up as well, where they said, no, our symptoms are still gone. And this was actually repeated in another town in Hitchburg, Switzerland. And it was in Hitchburg, there was also different shapes buried. And so people started asking for, so we do have a lot of products that maybe we've mentioned, such as, you can see there's a lot there, and we talked about the pendant and different things like that. One of the things about biogeometry is we're not a product-based company, in the sense that the product actually never existed before the research. And so with the cube, what ended up happening is people said, well, how can we do this in our community? And in Switzerland, it was different, because we had the support of Swisscom. They gave us access to the towers. The community gave us access to everything. There was the government support, there was access from the community. And so this is where the cube comes in. It looks like a cube with little notches and numbers, but actually every single one of those notches is like a miniature shape that's like the Hamburg emitter embedded in. And it has all of those shapes that were buried in Hitchburg, for example, or placed in different areas in Hamburg. So again, it looks like tiny little notches. You can see them maybe on the side.
I don't know if you can see that okay in the camera there?
It's, yeah, I think like they can see little, just looks like strokes.
Yeah, awesome. Anyway, that's always on my desk, and we've got another one in the living room. So go
Yeah,
ahead, Doreya.
and you have a Hamburg also emitter there as well. So
Yeah.
Is that glass? What's that material?
plastic,
Okay.
just but plexiglass.
I'm just thinking right now, because my son has a 3D printer, you know, being able to get this out more by giving the schematics and people buying those or whatever, open sourcing those so people can print those at their home.
I mean, with a lot
You
of the
aren't-
tools, they have to be
You aren't-
adjusted.
ahead.
So like, because we were saying about dialing in the Hamburg emitter. So a lot of times they come with they actually on the emitter, it's not just the shape, but then you adjust an angle on the shape. And so when you're trying to, that way you can point this towards cell phone, but you can also point it towards things such as satellite dishes and different things like that. But definitely, I mean, one of the goals of biogeometry, I mean, we've talked a lot about, we mentioned it in the intro, but we brought up architects and designers. One of the huge goals of biogeometry is to teach design principles so that then anybody with a 3D printer can create products and things that have this energy quality within them. And so it depends now what obviously there's going to be, so for example, we have furniture that is created along these lines, carpets created along these lines. And our big goal is for this to be, we want to be careful and this is now as a science as our goal. There's certain shapes that we have, but we don't want, even when we showed things like the autistic classrooms, and you think of the word biogeometry, if you look at the shape of the autistic classroom, you could say it's quite geometric. And even when we see the shapes of the stands here. And so what we want to always do is we try to do this approach where we're trying to have it as a language that anybody who's interested in any type of design can implement into their work without it being a style that we've superimposed. Because if it just becomes a set of shapes or a set of numbers, then we've just lost the actual basis of what we call the physics of quality. And this is actually really important because there's a larger goal there when we understand the ability to have a science based on a qualitative scale versus that mental subconscious information, is that if you were to come to the biogeometry community, and I would say it's the only place where I've seen people from every single type of energy work background, and it doesn't have to be energy, even MDs, even who can actually learn what we call the physics of quality and suddenly start speaking common ground, because we've explained things in the terms of a vibrational scale. And that's a huge goal, because one of the things that we've seen a lot is that we want to be careful. The reason the physics of quality in biogeometry is so important is right now, a lot of the alternative solutions are coming out as a reaction to our medical or modern system failing in some areas. And that in a way makes them emerge positively, but on shaky ground. And so in the same principle, if they emerge without their own scale. So to give you an example, we do a lot of research in biogeometry that's considered mainstream. There's even published peer-reviewed papers. But nobody's, if people see that as the highest bar, right? When we say, and we obviously it's important to prove that what you have works. So things like having the PhDs and thesis and papers in biogeometry is really important. But then what if we were to come to say, okay, so this is you evaluating us, or the mainstream evaluating us. But what if we would come to say, there's more to it than that? There's actually, now we have a scale where we can evaluate your solution and say, okay, so as a physical solution, it's great. But as a multidimensional energy solution, it's lacking this and this and this and this. And that's actually what that physics of quality gives us. And so it's actually one of the reasons why you will find, even though it's there, like if you go, for example, for access to the shapes, I mean, I'll say this, if you go on the website, we have a paper emitter that anybody can download, and you can create, or you can cut out the shape and create a pendant, but you just have to clear it every day, wash it with salt and water. But at the end of the day, the reason that we don't have it so much where we're saying, okay, so everybody put this shape everywhere, is because we want to come back and explain there's actually, if you can understand the laws that we call the physics of quality, then you can recreate it in every single field that you're interested in. And our community has done that. Like if there's anything, like a lot of times I'll be like, okay, so, or I come up with something and I think of, okay, how can I bring biogeometry into that, or things like that. Even just going into the student groups, they also help show us how other professionals have implemented these principles in their fields.
And the great attribute is customization, because the first thing that struck me is off about, conventional and even alternative medicine that I learned later on is we have all these recipe approaches. And with biogeometry, you're really accommodating the unique biogeometrical composition of every single life form. Can you maybe contrast a little bit about maybe some of our friends in our community that are using orgone devices, to combat electro smog and things like that versus biogeometry? I know we've already kind of touched on it and explained a little bit, but maybe the extra dimension of biogeometry might bring to the table, and why I think it's greatly overlooked with a lot of our community that's into a lot of other technologies that are great, but I think we can go the next level with biogeometry.
I mean, I'll say that what I can bring to the table is the orgone devices that I've seen from students and the adjustments that they've had to make. So one of the things, for example, is a lot of times the shapes that they're in. And so a lot of times you'll find them in a pyramid shape or in a hemispherical shape. And it's important to understand that these two shapes are actually what we call energy emitters. And if we understand things like in sacred architecture, you would have the domes placed on power spots. In Egypt, the pyramids are placed on a power spot. So what's very important is that these shapes, pyramids and domes, they actually need, so they can be both as a perfect hemisphere and a pyramid as copied with four-sided pyramid. These are actually energy emitting shapes, but they need a type of correction. So when we look at pyramids, most people aren't aware that the Great Pyramid is 8-sided. It has a little indent, and that creates what we call a type of clockwise rotation, and then deals also with the principles of 8. And with a hemisphere, a lot of times when you look at dome structures and how they're placed on power spots, they're never perfect domes. They either are you have them elongated on the bottom, or you have an element on the top. And all of these actually serve to make sure that we have the emitting property that is the positive aspect of negative green and not the negative aspect of negative green. And people who are familiar with pyramids, they're aware of this information, but haven't pieced it together. People who are really interested in pyramid shapes are completely aware that pyramid shapes are dehydrating, but yet they will still do things like meditate below them. And so they're aware of that. They just haven't assimilated that dehydrating means it's pulling out life force energy from our system, versus that it's increasing that. And maybe it shouldn't be shaped that you meditate necessarily under. It's the same thing with creating orgone emitters. You don't want to create them in these two shapes. And then more than that, since they are energy emitters, you have to be very aware of the energy that they are emitting. So you have to have a way of evaluating the effect. And so for different people, that might show up in different ways. And biogeometry for us, if I see a shape that has vertical negative green, which a lot of times I do see them in hemisphere and pyramid shapes, it doesn't matter to me what they're made out of. The shape itself is resonating with electromagnetic fields. So it's not actually, it cannot transmute the vertical negative green effect if the shape itself has that.
And
And then there's a lot.
there's a well-known French radiesthesist that had a very unfortunate experience with that, right? Is that what was used by the Egyptians in mummification procedures, do you think?
I mean, they were, of course, aware of different shapes that have different dehydrating types of effects. And so, I mean, one of the things that they did actually find, I know with the mummies, is that when they moved them to areas, there's also, they could have been using vertical negative green for dehydration, but not the same type of effect that we're finding from electricity today, because there's a lot of cases where when they would move the mummies, the deterioration would start very fast. And they weren't sure why they were no longer being preserved the same way that they were preserved in their original locations. And you will see more and more, one of the big things in biogeometry that we try to say is stop moving things. Stop moving things into museums, leave them to be where they are. Stop moving sites, especially rebuilding them. And also just try to recreate kind of keep the things, the sacredness around certain things, and maybe don't have mummies on display in museums, and don't change sites or alter things the way that we are doing, because there's a lot more to it than what meets the eye.
So Doreya, there's so much more I'd love to talk about, but in our last few minutes here, could we at least touch upon biosignatures? These are just biosignature strips that I use on my archetype ruler. I've kind of made a whole set of them there so I can do some quick analysis. And, acupuncture, to me, that I've practiced for many years, is about creating the continuity between ourselves and what we think of as our external system. But biogeometry brings a whole new element to it, which are the energy pathways innate to every single tissue of the body. So, another great dimension that you can bring to the practice of medicine.
I mean, one of the things I'll say, I mean, I mentioned how the cube came from Hemberg and Hitchberg. So biosignatures actually came from, you just said it yourself. Those familiar with the acupuncture and the meridian system, those familiar with that system, that's it. You're already aware that that shape of the human body has energy lines running through it. Now, if we can make the leap to understand that this exists not in the shape of the human body, just the shape of the human body, but the shape of every organ has energy lines running through it. And this would be the basis of understanding biosignatures. And so biosignatures are, and this is where we begin to see, it's important to understand that even when we draw something like a line, there's an energy flow movement there. We look at it and we think that this is stagnant, but when we talk about even the forming process of the line, we talk about, you can measure the start of the line, you can measure the end of the line, and it's always really interesting because the start of a line has that ultraviolet quality, which actually relates to a sunrise, the end of the line to sunset. So it really begins to also tie in this whole idea of cyclicality and as above, so below, and how we have all favorite.
That's my favorite biogeometry exercise. And, just so when your intention goes now, you can so measure it brings so many things into perspective. Sorry, I was talking over you there. Sorry, could you say that again?
No, I don't think you talked over me, or maybe there was a lag in the audio, but yeah. So I was saying, so with the biosignature, we can begin to study the organ energy flow. And so you can begin now, just imagine that there's an energy flow that's supposed to look like this in the body. And then something happens where that energy flow becomes distorted. So maybe it's moving something like this. Now, what we need to introduce, if we can introduce within the energy system, the original energy flow, then there will be information exchange between them. They will start to balance each other out. Now, that's where our pendant comes in, or the ring that you were also showing. So I have it as the pendant, and it has all of these different biosignatures on it. And so the pendant actually came from hepatitis C research, where in Egypt, they were studying, they were doing at Azhar University, the medical department was doing a comparative study of available solutions for hepatitis C. And they asked if biogeometry could be part of the study. And at that time, they didn't call it a pendant, they called it a chip because it was like a little plastic thing with shapes. And then the head of the dean of the university actually went out on TV and explained that, okay, so we're actually seeing an effect from these shapes. We're doing all of our protocols, we have everything, but we are seeing this effect from the shapes. The study's still going to continue. We're going to have more stages going on. And actually the effect that he was talking about was a 90% normalizing of liver enzymes. And this was, and for a lot of the patients who could afford testing, about 2/3 would show viral clearance. And so he went out and said that. Then the study got shut down for some reasons, and people tried to put funding towards the study. The university said, well, you can't choose where the funding goes, but you can give it to the university. But that's a side story that would probably take us off track. But basically, after announcing the results, then people said, okay, well, how can we get this pendant? And they showed up at the office. And then this is where we had now what the pendant is. It's a combination of, obviously in the hepatitis C, there was an emphasis on the liver biosignature, but the pendant is really just introducing, and that's the emitter I was saying people can go in and just download off the website and play around with. It's under resources on the BioGeometry website if they scroll all the way down. But it has, that pendant had more of an emphasis on liver biosignatures. But what we do now is we combine a set of biosignatures across the whole body, and then we put them in the energy system. And that's how we begin to center the energy exchange of the organ with the environment. And so we've seen in a recent, for example, in a recent PhD, this was actually tested as an interior design strip with depressed mice, showing that it raised their serotonin levels as much as the most common drugs on the market do for this case.
Wow, that is so cool.
Sorry, I was just looking for my Biosignatures book for show and tell. But
Oh, actually,
Doreya,
I should have mentioned that. I should have mentioned that there's a book and you can see the biosignatures there. And
it's an amazing book. I'd recommend anybody. And your father has a new book coming out, which I'm very excited to read. So I'll tell you what, since we're needing to finish up here, can you, are there any other comments you'd like to make or things that you'd like to cover that we haven't? Or an additional, maybe tell us where we can find all these things and find you, and how people could sign up for a study if they care to?
I mean, as far as finding us, it's if you go on the website, it's biogeometry.ca or .com. On there, they'll find courses and events. If they scroll down, they'll see the resources. Those who like what we spoke about with the horizontal and vertical pendulum, they'll actually also find that pendulum manual on there. So if they felt like because we obviously we didn't explain it from the beginning, but the manual has the development process. There's 2 books. And well, it was, I mean, really nice to come on this podcast, I'll say, because yesterday we actually sent the book out and it left our hands after a year or 2 of just editing. Well, for me, it was editing, for my father, writing. And
here's the little pamphlet that comes with those pendulums, and I think that's what you're referring to.
Yes, so that's available as a PDF, and I think for those who wanted to see the technical aspect of the pendulum, that's there. I mean, it's they can read through it. There's 2 books, like you mentioned, the courses, and we're working on more and more resources.
Beautiful. So biogeometry.com, biogeometryshop.com for products. I'll put all those links in the show notes below, guys. So please go there. And there's they have resellers you can go to get products. There's all sorts of ways to get products, from them. One question in the chat that is coming up since the orgone thing with the orgonite. A lot of people in our community make their own orgonite. They're wondering what would be the most ideal shape then for, say, if you're going to be using that to remediate electrosmog in your house, or like what a lot of us do is we go quote unquote bust 5G towers. Is there an ideal shape?
I mean, with the pyramid shape, if usually what we do is if you can actually copy the actual indent that's there, then you would be doing that until you get that BG3 energy quality. Or even just if you're using the hemisphere shape, just again, looking at it in sacred architecture and doing those elongations. And so those would be at least corrections for those shapes that they would be doing. Ideally as well, I mean, if somebody was to learn, and measuring with the BG16 isn't difficult to learn, we hope to have, once the book is out, which was out, like I mentioned, we sent it out yesterday, we're going to be working on hopefully some more public videos, even just showing how to basically measure this BG3 energy quality. And so it's not just the shape, but in actually the creation process itself. This can be implemented from the start.
So another good reason for learning biogeometry, in that even if you're involved in another technology, you can really refine it to another whole level.
Beautiful. Hey, thanks so much for joining us today, Doreya. This has been such an educational and illuminating and inspirational talk. Guys, please go to biogeometry.com to find out more. And what's up with any classes coming up, or how would someone join to actually go into the coursework that like Bear did?
So since COVID, there has been online classes. Hopefully physical classes or the live classes will pick up again soon. And just if they go to the calendar, courses and events, I know that myself and my sister have a class in March. Dr. Gilbert has a class in February. And then you also have another instructor in Europe, Chris Attar, and he'll also teach. I'm talking about the English classes now, and he'll also add classes regularly every month. So there'll be, no matter what time zone you're on, there'll be a class for you. Hopefully, just keep an eye out on the calendar. If you go in and the classes are full or the times don't work, there are more added a lot.
Fantastic. And I think I'm going to take a refresher course pretty soon myself, because it's been a while. Just to keep up on everything. So thank you again so much. And I really look forward to meeting you in person someday. And now that hopefully the plan is traveling a little more freely, we can make that happen. I unfortunately had to do mine
before coming on
online.
air. Both of you mentioned Egypt being on your bucket list. So that was very easy.
That would be so amazing to take a course there.
Yeah, and hopefully, I mean, we are, and obviously since you've taken the classes, there was always the plan to do a biogeometry event in Egypt. And now that the book is out and we can focus on those new levels and different things, I mean, hopefully that plan will happen sooner than later. How
cool would it be to go to Giza and do the measurements there and really see where it all came from, and the true sort of pragmatic effects of it and everything. That would be really phenomenal. So,
and we do that. We have classes here. We go to the pyramids and go inside and try to do some measurements there, and it's always fun to do.
That sounds so fun. Well, thanks so much, Doreya, for joining us today. I hope you guys all enjoyed this. If you do, give us a thumbs up, share with your friends and family. It really helps us out, get this information going to those who really need it more than ever. I would say it's such a fantastic solution for everyone. Thanks again. And we'll see you next week with Kathy O'Brien coming back on to bring some spiritual enlightenment through all the craziness she's been through. And Bear, you'll be down south. So you'll be coming to us live and direct from beautiful Southern California. Looking forward to it. Thanks, guys.
My grandkids will be surfing in the backdrop at Rincon Beach during that episode. So that should be fun.
I will be extremely jealous. Okay, thanks everyone. Happy holidays. For those in celebrating, please go to our website if you want more information on us, alfavedic.com, alfavedic.com, or you can join us on Telegram, t.me/alfavedic, or on Patreon, patreon.com/alfavedic. Love you guys. See you next week. Later.